So I've told you about myself, daddy, granddad. Now it's time probably to tell you a little bit about my mother. My mother had a very, very, very hard childhood and did so much with her life considering how it all started out. My mother's father, Jake Weber, was a good man and had a wonderful little family, a wife and four little girls, and one more on the way when he had a terrible accident, which made everyone's life difficult. So I know very, very little about him and not much about my mother's childhood. Mother didn't like to talk about it very much. A lot of what I know, I learned from Aunt Georgie and Aunt Ima. So I'll tell you what I know, leave it at that. When my mother was young, her father had managed somehow to buy a truck. And he used the truck to buy produce from farmers and sometimes even ranchers and take this produce to a large town where he would sell it to grocery stores or from the truck on the street. And he was making a fairly good living. The one story I do remember my mom telling me was when she was about 4 or maybe 5 years old, of visiting here at the ranch. She met Mother Peebles and my grandmother and my daddy when she was just a little bitty girl. Her father had come down here because he heard that my grandparents had a very large garden and he wanted to buy produce from them to take to either Roswell or El Paso or wherever he was selling the produce. And while my grandmother and granddad were out looking at the garden and selecting produce and gathering it and boxing it up, and I guess talking about how much he was going to pay for it, Aunt Georgie and Aunt Louise and Mama, and probably Aunt Ima, though she was pretty young at that time, were told to stay with Mother Peebles. And Mother Peebles had gathered peas, and that day she was shelling peas. And so she sat the girls down, and even though they were guests and she didn't know them from Adam, they were helping her shell peas. And my mother said that she was very stern and kind of scary and not at all like her mother or anyone else that my mother knew. And she said she scared Mother People scared her to death, and she was afraid to even pop one of those luscious, delicious little peas in her mouth because they all had to go in the bowl. That's the only time she ever met my great grandmother or any of my family until she married Daddy. So I thought that was a very funny little story. But she was so impressed by my great grandmother. She also remembered meeting my dad at that time too. But she was a little girl and he was already a grown up, and she didn't know he was probably, well, if she was 6, he would have been 16 or 17, but he was so grown up that she thought he was an adult. So um but it wasn't too long after that. It was a Christmas season, and Grandpa Jake had either gone out and onto the forest or and cut trees, or he had bought trees from ranchers or people who wanted to thin trees out. And he had a whole truck load of Christmas trees. And he started down the road. At that time, they lived in the Upper Bonita area. And he had started down the road and had a head-on collision with another vehicle. I don't know what that vehicle was. I know that he was seriously injured, His back was broken in a couple of places. In those days, it would have been the late 30s. The drug of preference by doctors for pain was cocaine. And so when he was in the hospital, he was being given massive doses of cocaine for the pain and also to keep him still so he didn't move so that his back had a chance to heal. Well, his back did have a chance did heal. He was able to walk and move around, though for the rest of his life he was in very bad pain. Well, times changed and it came time for him to get off the cocaine. I think in those days it was called laudanum. The the preparation wasn't just like cocaine given intravenously. It was an elixir called laudanum, and the doctors tried to get him off the cocaine. In those days, they didn't know you had to wean somebody off cocaine, and they didn't have the drugs that they have now to help people and to help with the pain so that you can get off cocaine. And the doctors tried 3 or 4 times, even admitting him to the hospital to try to help in the cocaine habit. And unfortunately, every time they tried, they almost lost him. He almost died each time. So they told him that for the rest of his life he would be on cocaine. And he was until he died in I think 1959. He was so disheartened and so unhappy with his life that in 1959 he committed suicide. But one of the reasons he was disheartened was because the first time they tried to take him off cocaine and he almost died, my grandmother decided to divorce him. By that time, they had 5 little girls. They had Louise, who was the oldest, and Georgie, and then Mom, and then Aunt Ima, and Aunt Betty. And Aunt Betty was born and a child, started school right before the end of polio, right before the polio vaccines became available. And so Aunt Betty got polio. So my grandmother decided that she would divorce Grandpa Jake and move back to Texas. She preferred West Texas. And so she took the girls and she left. Well, she didn't have much of an education and she wasn't much for working and she didn't get along with very many people. So they didn't have much to eat. My mother, as a consequence, did not believe you had a meal unless you had pinto beans on the table, because that's pretty much what she ate when she was growing up. She did tell me about one, I don't know if it was a Thanksgiving or a Christmas, but it was one special occasion when her mother managed to get a chicken. And they had what they considered a feast for the 6 of them being one chicken. Aunt Ima told me that she remembered Aunt Georgie and Aunt Louise and Mama being sent out by my grandmother into the cotton fields to pick cotton to earn enough money that they could buy food. She was too little to pick much cotton, and so her job was to stay home and take care of Aunt Betty. I don't know what my grandmother did. As far as I can tell, until her late years in life, where she started taking care of older people who needed someone to stay with them, she never worked. She made everybody else around her work to support her. So it doesn't surprise me that she had Mama and Aunt Georgie and Aunt Louise out in the cotton fields picking cotton. Out of all of the 5 sisters, for some reason, and I assume it's genetics, we'll never know exactly why, Mom had dyslexia. We didn't find out about her dyslexia until my brother John was in school, and John was diagnosed, and the teachers uh, at the school were trying to explain to Mom how they knew he had dyslexia. And at that time, the teachers at that time discovered that Mother had it too. Mother was extraordinarily intelligent because she managed to hide from just about everyone the fact that she couldn't read. When I was in school, when I was in first and second grade, I remember I had to bring home my reading book and read my little book to my mother. I was supposed to read every night, and so we would sit down in front of the gas heater, the gas fire. Um, I don't even know how to explain it. It wasn't really a fireplace, but it was more than just a heater. You could see the fire in it. It was an old-fashioned stove that we had in the house, and we would sit down in front of that on pillows, and I would read to my mother. Well, I understand now why I had such a hard time reading, because when I was reading to my mother didn't know whether I was saying the right words, the correct words, or not. I do remember that she did the same thing with my brother Jim. And when Marshall came along, Marshall Marshall would sit down and he would read to my mother, and he was such a good reader. Everybody was so impressed at home because Marshall could read, the first day he could read the whole first reader for the first grade. And it wasn't until later in the year that they figured out that Marshall had memorized the books from when Jim and Jim and I were reading them to Mother. So it was tip, tip, tip. Well, come here, tip. I remember the very very simple ones too, you know. But I remember the books Tip and Mitten, and Tip was a little dog and Mitten was a little cat. But it wasn't until Daddy was killed that Mother even admitted. No, she didn't even at that time admit to me that she couldn't read. I would bring home the mail, and while she was cooking dinner, she would have me open all of the mail and read it to her. And then she would dictate what she wanted done. Write a check for this amount, for the correct amount for this, and address the envelope and send it back. Whatever the mail required. While Mother was cooking dinner when I first got home from school, we would go through the mail, and I felt so very important to be included in taking care of this. I felt like such an adult. Well, at 12 or 13 years old, when your mother gives you that kind of responsibility, and spends that kind of time with you, you do feel like you're important. I did not realize at the time that my mother could not read, and she couldn't write. Well, let me put it this way: I do not spell well. Neither does Jim, neither does Marshall, and neither does John. Mother only has 2 children who can spell at all, because we all have various degrees of dyslexia, just like Mother. Unfortunately, we had teachers who taught us coping skills. Dyslexia wasn't a thing when I was in school. It was just, oh, she's dumb. She needs a little bit of extra help. But I did have some teachers who worked to teach me coping skills for reading and writing and spelling, and eventually became a voracious reader. But when my sisters Zada and Geneva were little, there was a brand new show on TV that came on every day for an hour or so. And my mother sat down and watched it with my sisters. It was called Sesame Street. And my mother actually started learning to read by watching Sesame Street when she was in her 30s. She never became a great reader, but at least she could read her own mail. And she did more or less teach herself how to write, though spelling was not ever her thing. But considering that when she was young, her mother would find a place to rent, move the girls in, send them to school sometimes keep them home or send them out to work. And they would stay there for 6 months to, well, maybe 6 months. And then they would have to move again because um, my grandmother could not pay the rent. And so she would have to move. And so they moved from this little town to that little, and they would go through all the cheap shanties and stuff like that they could find to live in until that town, she got a reputation that she didn't pay her bills and they couldn't get credit at the grocery store, and then she would move to the next little town, and that's pretty much how my mother grew up. So she never had a chance to be in a school where she had one teacher for the whole year. And there were many times when she wasn't in school, not because she was ill, but because she was out trying to earn money to buy food. And so when she was probably about 13 or 14, Grandpa Bill came around, and I don't know if he was a neighbor or if he was someone that hired Mom and the girls, or I don't know how he became acquainted with Grandma. But after meeting the girls, uh, he decided that he would marry Grandma so that there was consistent food on the table for the girls. Grandpa Bill got a job offer as, not sure what you would call it, as a farmer um, for Mrs. Arnold. Mrs. Arnold had a lot of big, good farmland. She had all the tools and equipment and stuff like that, but her husband had been dead for a number of years, and her sons had grown up and wanted to move away other places because they thought the living would be easier. So Mrs. Arnold hired Grandpa Bill to come and farm her land. And she had, I'm not sure exactly what you would call it. In my memory, it was an old shack. I remember when I was 4 or 5 years old, Grandpa Bill and Grandma and well, by that time it was Aunt Betty and Martha and the twins. Martha and the twins are Bill and my grandmother's girls, living in this shack very close to Mrs. Arnold's. I remember going up and visiting Mrs. Arnold for years before and after they moved in up there. And I didn't remember those shacks. And basically that's what it was. I think you probably, Grandma used some kind of glue or paste and pasted layers of newspaper on the inside wall of the shack to keep the wind from blowing through. But they lived there, until I started school. It was the longest time that I can remember that Grandma stayed in one place. And they were living there. I think they must have moved there right after World War II. I know they were living there in 1948 because in that summer, my mother had gotten a job as a maid and part-time nanny for a local rancher and his wife who lived up on the high mesa. And my dad had gone up to visit these people because they were neighbors. And for the life of me, I can't remember the names now. It doesn't really matter what their names are, but Dad had gone up to visit, maybe to help out with their farming. They had a big farming concern up there and raised oat hay up on top of the mesa. And Dad had gone up there maybe to buy hay, maybe to help with something. I don't know why. But at noon, he was invited in to have dinner with the family before they went back out and did some more work, which that was a pretty normal thing for one rancher to do with someone who was helping them out for some reason. He saw Mother, and after they finished the day, he went and actually sat down on the steps and talked with Mom for a little bit, and he was in love. Mom was at that time probably 16 or 17, and Dad was 27. Well, 26 or 27. At any rate, Dad told me that the first time he saw Mother, he fell in love. He thought she was the cutest and the sweetest little thing he had ever seen. So he started courting her, going up to the neighbor's house and taking her flowers and taking her out for a walk and inviting her out to Ruidoso where they had a theater for a movie and that kind of thing. And after about 3 months, he asked her to marry him. Mom told me that she wasn't too keen on the idea. She thought he was a little bit old for her. But she went home and told her mother that he had asked her to marry him. And Grandma told Mom, "You will say yes, and you will marry him, because he's a wealthy man, and I didn't raise a daughter who would turn down an advantage like that. So either you marry him, or you take what belongs to you out of this house and you go find a job and support yourself, because I don't support somebody who won't take advantage of good luck when it's offered to them." Well, something along, I can't remember exactly what Mother told me that Grandma told her, but something along those veins. For certain, she said either she married him or she moved out. Even though she was working as a maid and supporting her family, no, she was told she would marry him. Because in my grandmother's eyes, he was a very wealthy man. So Mom said yes, and they got married. And I don't know to this day whether my mom was ever in love with my dad. I know that she did love him and she did care for him. I remember my grandmother saying that, well, they got married in September. My grandmother found out in October that my mother didn't even own a coat. She had 2 dresses, the one she got married in, and an everyday dress. And that was about all she brought with her when she got married, was the 2 dresses and a sweater. Mom told me that that was all that she had. She and Aunt Ima had 2 nice dresses. One that both of them had been given to her either by Aunt Louise or by Aunt Georgie, had been given to Mom and Ima. And they took turns wearing them. And they each had one dress that they used for school or to wear that they had made the previous year in home ec. And that was basically the only clothing that they had. So my grandmother got out the Sears and Roebuck catalog and ordered some fabric and sat Mother down at her treadle sewing machine, the old Singer treadle sewing machine that you pumped with your feet, and taught Mother how to make for herself simple clothing. So Mother ended up with more clothes than she'd ever owned in her life, or that she could remember. And when she married Daddy, she couldn't believe that there was milk to drink every day, that there was meat on the table every day, and that she could have as many green beans as she wanted. So she said she was very skinny when she married Daddy, but it wasn't long until she started putting on weight. But I mean, she didn't get fat or anything like that, but she filled out, And she was a very, very pretty little thing, as my dad said. For our wedding gift, my dad gave her a Palomino horse, very much like Buttermilk. And I have to explain Buttermilk to those of you who do not know who Buttermilk was. Roy Rogers had his horse Trigger, and Dale Evans was his wife, and Dale Evans' horse was a Palomino named Buttermilk. But Mother's horse was named Pritzy May. Pritzy, I have no idea where that comes from, but May because she was born in the month of May. And she was a 2-year-old and had just been broken. And so one of the first things that my dad did was teach my mother how to ride a horse. And I can remember growing up, a lot of times my grandmother would be making dinner for everybody, and Jim and Marshall and I would be in her care, and Mother and Daddy and Granddad would go out and work the cattle together. After Dad started working away from the house, it was just Mother and Granddad. Now, my granddad thought that my mother should be put among the stars. He and my grandmother had wanted to have a little girl and didn't. And he thought the world of my mother. My grandmother, unfortunately, was a bit jealous. She had had Daddy and Granddad to herself for 27 years, and all of a sudden this sweet little thing moves in and takes the affection of her son and a little bit of the affection of her husband away from her. And so my grandmother, Honey, was not always as nice as she should be to my mother. As a matter of fact, she was, well, they had a pretty good competition going. I think my mother didn't like my grandmother just about as much as my grandmother didn't like my mother. So they fought kind of consistently, which was unfortunate since they lived like 100 yards apart. But my mother was a worker. She was out in the spring with Granddad planting garden. And she would get up in the morning and go out and weed the garden until the boys and I woke up, and then she would cook us breakfast, and then she was either out working cattle with Granddad or working in the garden. As soon as we were old enough, she had us working in the garden with her. Fall comes and the harvest comes, and it was harvest, and she spent days and days and days canning fruits and vegetables and all those kinds of things and putting them in the root cellars so that we would have food. The one thing that I can say about my mother, now she never did learn to become a really good cook, except for when it comes to breads and cakes. My mom could make breads and cakes like nobody's business. She overcooked her meat. It was almost like shoe leather. And she overcooked her vegetables, but we never, ever, ever, ever went hungry. The one thing that my mother insisted that was that we have 3 good meals a day, and usually dessert with every meal, because my mom did like desserts. And that we all learn to cook and take care, of ourselves as far as being able to cook food. I didn't learn until I was grown up that my mother overcooked the vegetables and that my mother overcooked the meat. I mean, that was just the way it was. That's what was put on the table. But I can remember for breakfast having sausage, bacon, maybe a beefsteak, hash brown potatoes, and eggs. And that was a typical breakfast for us. My mother, um, I was pretty round as a child from the time I was like in the 3rd grade until I was 13 or 14. I was pretty round because we ate very well. We worked too. As I said, we didn't have much playtime. We did a lot of working. But my mother made sure that we were very, very well fed. And she worked hard. She was a hard worker. Considering what she had gone through as a child and what life gave her and how she was treated as a child, my mother did a remarkable lot when it came to raising my brothers and myself. Now, I won't say that she was a gentle, loving mother. She wasn't. She was a pretty harsh, pretty demanding mother. She had very little opinion of the value of girls. And I think that's because she had been told her entire life as a young woman that girls were worthless, that sons were the only value. She was particularly hard on me because I was the girl. I think by the time she married my stepfather and had Geneva and Zada and John, she had changed her mind a little bit. Though, even at the end, I think John got a lot, who was the baby of the family, got a lot more privileges and attention and love and respect from my mom than the girls ever did. I know that my brother certainly did. But but for all of that, she was a very giving person when it came to the things that people needed. She wasn't so much a giving person when it came to love and comfort and that kind of stuff. But if there was something you really needed, if you were ill, she was going to nurse you. If you were hungry, she was going to feed you. If you needed clothing, she was going to make sure that you got that clothing. It might not be top of the line clothing. It might be handmade clothing, but it was clothing. And and she was that way not only with our family, but I can remember having friends in school who were in want, who reminded her of herself as a young child. And I can remember one particular time when my mother took fabric that had been for planned for clothing for me, some flour sacks and stuff like that, and made a couple of skirts and a couple of blouses for some girls who I went to school with. And she took them to their house. It took me to play with them, and took these clothes that she had made that had never been worn, and told the girl's mother, "These are dresses that Donna has outgrown. Do you think your girls might like them?" Because that's the kind of person she was. And also, she was the kind of person who enjoyed making hot dishes and casseroles and other things and sharing those with neighbors who might be a little bit hungry. So that's pretty much. I don't know, outside of the fact that I know my grandfather Weber had three sisters, one of whom was Aunt Ree, who mother met late in her life after she married Morgan, who she adored. I don't know much about the life of my grandpa Weber. I don't know anything about Grandma. I asked her one time, I was trying to do a genealogy type thing for school, talk about your ancestors. And I asked my grandmother, and she told me, well, she didn't believe in talking about ancestors because if you went far enough back, she was sure you would find a horse thief. So I figured there must be one in her background because I couldn't find anyone anywhere else. But so I know absolutely nothing about the childhood or the life of Mother's mother. And so I don't know what made her into the kind of person she was. But I'm glad my mother survived because I wouldn't be here otherwise. So that's about as much as I can say on that side of the family. Outside of the fact that I will say that Aunt Louise and Aunt Georgie and Aunt Ima and Mama were good people. They survived. They loved each other and they loved their families. And I am absolutely certain that's true of Aunt Betty. I remember riding the school bus with Aunt Betty, And I remember Aunt Betty came to Daddy's funeral. And other than that, I don't know much about her. She married young and moved away and had a lovely family. But I don't remember much about her, and I don't know much about her life either. So that's the end of my mother's story, and we'll go on to happier stories next time.